The black limousine pulled up to the back entrance of the Jimmy Kimmel live studio at exactly 6:30 in the evening. The driver stepped out and opened the door for his famous passenger. Clint Eastwood emerged slowly, his tall frame unfolding, from the back seat with the careful movements of a man who had lived 94 years. He wore a simple dark suit and his signature scowl that had made him famous in countless Western movies. Kate Miller, the show's producer, was waiting by the stage door with a warm smile and a clipboard in her hand. She had worked on late-night television for 15 years, but she still felt excited when big stars came to the show. Clint Eastwood was not just any star. He was a legend who had been making movies since before she was born. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to our show," Kate said, extending her hand. "I'm Kate Miller, the producer. We're so honored to have you here tonight." Clint shook her hand with a firm grip but said nothing. His blue eyes looked around the busy hallway where crew members rushed back and forth preparing for the show. Kate noticed he seemed more serious than most guests who usually appeared nervous or excited. There was something different about his mood tonight. "How was your drive over?" Kate asked as she led him down the narrow hallway toward the green room. The walls were covered with photos of famous guests who had appeared on the show over the years. "Fine," Clint replied in his famous gravelly voice. He walked with his hands in his pockets, taking in everything around him. This was not his first time on a talk show, but it had been many years since he had done television interviews. He preferred the quiet of his ranch to the bright lights and loud sounds of Hollywood studios. The green room was small but comfortable, with soft chairs and a table full of snacks and drinks. A television mounted on the wall showed the current taping of the show. Jimmy Kimmel was doing his opening monologue, making jokes about politicians and celebrities. The studio audience laughed loudly at each punchline. "Can I get you anything to drink?" Kate asked. "We have coffee, water, soft drinks, whatever you need." "Coffee would be good," Clint said, settling into one of the chairs. His publicist, Lisa Barnes, sat down next to him and pulled out her phone to check messages. Lisa had been working with Clint for over 10 years and knew his moods better than anyone. Tonight, he seemed more tense than usual. Kate poured coffee from a silver pot into a white mug and handed it to Clint. "The interview should be pretty straightforward," she said. "Jimmy wants to talk about your new movie and maybe some stories from your long career. Nothing too heavy or controversial." Clint nodded and sipped his coffee. On the television screen, Jimmy was now talking to his first guest, a young actress promoting her new romantic comedy. The conversation was light and funny, full of the kind of jokes that made late-night television popular with younger audiences. As Kate left the room to check on other preparations, 2 crew members walked past the open doorway. They were talking loudly enough for everyone in the green room to hear their conversation. "Can you believe they got Clint Eastwood on the show?" one of them said. "I thought he was retired or something. He must be ancient by now." "Yeah, my grandpa loves his movies," the other replied with a laugh. "All that tough guy stuff from the old days. I wonder if he'll fall asleep during the interview." Both men laughed as they continued down the hallway. Clint's jaw tightened, and his grip on the coffee mug became firmer. Lisa noticed the change in his expression and looked up from her phone. "Don't pay attention to them," she whispered. "They're just kids who don't know any better." But Clint was already bothered. He had spent his entire career earning respect in Hollywood through hard work and dedication. He had directed award-winning movies and created characters that people still remembered decades later. Being treated like some old relic who was past his prime made his blood boil. Tony Lopez, the security guard assigned to watch the green room area, could see that something had changed in the famous actor's mood. Tony had worked at the studio for 8 years and had learned to read the signs when guests were getting upset. He made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. A few minutes later, Danny Clark, the show's warm-up comedian, poked his head into the green room. Danny's job was to keep the studio audience entertained during commercial breaks and before the show started. "Hey there, Mr. Eastwood," Danny said with a big grin. "I just wanted to say hi. I'm a huge fan of your movies. Dirty Harry is one of my all-time favorites." Clint looked up and managed a small smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "I've got the audience all warmed up for you," Danny continued. "They're really excited to see you." Most of them probably grew up watching your westerns on television with their parents. Again, there was that reference to his age and the past. Clint felt his irritation growing, but he kept it hidden behind his famous poker face. Danny meant, well, but his words only reminded Clint of how the younger generation saw him as a relic from another time. Lisa's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly and frowned. There might be a small problem, she said quietly to Clint. I just heard from a contact at another network. Apparently, Jimmy made some jokes about you during his monologue earlier this week. Nothing too bad? But he mentioned the chair incident from the Republican convention. Clint's face darkened. The 2012 Republican National Convention speech, where he had talked to an empty chair representing President Obama, had become a source of mockery for years afterward. He thought people had finally moved on from that moment, but apparently, it was still being used for cheap laughs. What exactly did he say? Clint asked in a low voice. Something about old actors talking to furniture. Lisa replied reluctantly. Like I said, it wasn't too harsh, but you know how these things get blown up on social media. The coffee in Clint's hand had grown cold, but he didn't notice. His mind was focused on what was coming next. He had agreed to do this interview to promote his new movie and connect with his fans. He had not signed up to be the target of political jokes or age-related humor. From the television screen, they could hear Jimmy wrapping up his segment with the young actress. Soon it would be time for Clint's interview. Kate Miller appeared in the doorway again, ready to escort him to the stage. We're ready for you, Mr. Eastwood, she said cheerfully, unaware of the storm brewing behind the legendary actor's steely blue eyes. The studio lights were brighter than Clint had expected. He walked slowly across the stage toward the guest chair, his boots making soft sounds on the polished floor. The studio audience erupted in loud applause and cheers as they saw the legendary actor approaching. Some people stood up from their seats, clapping their hands above their heads. Jimmy Kimmel stood behind his desk with a big smile on his face, clapping along with the audience. He was wearing his usual dark suit and tie, looking relaxed and confident. This was his show, his territory, and he knew how to work the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Clint Eastwood, Jimmy announced into his microphone. The applause grew even louder. Clint raised his hand slightly to acknowledge the audience, but his expression remained serious. Jake Peterson sat in the third row of the audience with his wife. He had been a fan of Clint Eastwood movies since he was a teenager. This is so cool, he whispered to his wife. I can't believe we're seeing him in person. Clint settled into the guest chair and adjusted his jacket. The chair was positioned at an angle so he could face both Jimmy and the audience. A small table between them held glasses of water and some note cards that Jimmy would use during the interview. Wow, what an honor this is, Jimmy said, as the applause finally died down. Clint Eastwood, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for having me, Clint replied in his deep, familiar voice. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, and he sat up straight with perfect posture. Nancy Wright operated one of the cameras from the side of the stage. She had been working as a camera operator for 12 years and had filmed hundreds of celebrity interviews. She zoomed in slightly to get a close-up of Clint's weathered face, noting how his eyes seemed more intense than usual for a talk show guest. So you have a new movie coming out, Jimmy said, looking down at his note cards. Tell us about it. What's it about? Clint began describing his latest film project, a drama about family relationships and forgiveness. His voice was steady and professional as he explained the story and what had attracted him to direct it. The audience listened quietly, hanging on every word from the Hollywood legend. That sounds really powerful, Jimmy said when Clint finished. You know, you've been making movies for, over 60 years now? That's incredible. Most people would have retired by now. There it was again. Another reference to his age. Clint's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice calm. I keep working because I love what I do, he said. Age is just a number. Right, Jimmy nodded. But seriously, you've seen so many changes in Hollywood over the decades. The industry must look completely different to someone who started back in the 50s and 60s. The way Jimmy said it made it sound like Clint was some kind of museum piece. Like he was a relic from ancient history who had somehow survived into the modern world. Clint could feel his irritation growing, but he tried to stay focused on promoting his movie. Hollywood has always been changing, Clint said. The technology is different, but good storytelling never goes out of style. That's true, Jimmy agreed. Speaking of changes, though, you've also been involved in politics over the years. You were mayor of Carmel, you spoke at the Republican convention. Do you still follow politics closely? This was the moment Clint had been dreading. He knew Jimmy. Kimmel was known for his political humor and his liberal views. The question seemed innocent enough, but Clint could sense where this was heading. I try to stay informed, Clint said carefully. But I'm not here to talk politics. I'm here to talk about my movie. Jimmy smiled, that television host smile that never quite reached his eyes. Of course, but that convention speech you gave back in 2012 was pretty memorable. You know, the one with the empty chair? A few people in the audience chuckled. Clint's face remained stone-faced, but inside he felt his anger beginning to build. He had hoped that embarrassing moment was finally behind him, but apparently it was still being used for cheap laughs. That was a long time ago, Clint said, his voice getting slightly colder. Oh, come on, it was great television, Jimmy continued, playing to the audience. I mean, who else would think to bring a chair on stage and have a conversation with it? It was so creative. More laughter from the audience. Jake Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could tell this wasn't going the way most celebrity interviews usually went. There was tension in the air that hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. Look, Clint said, leaning forward slightly in his chair. I came here to talk about my new movie, not to rehash old political moments. Can we get back to that? Jimmy raised his hands in mock surrender. Hey, no problem. I was just saying it was memorable. You've got to admit it became pretty famous. I think there were memes and everything. The word memes seemed to particularly bother Clint. It represented everything about modern culture that he didn't understand or appreciate. His life's work was being reduced to internet jokes and viral videos. I don't really care about memes, Clint said, his voice getting harder. Well, you should, Jimmy replied with a grin. That's how people communicate these days. Everything becomes a meme. Even this interview will probably become a meme by tomorrow. Paul Rodriguez, the stage manager, watched from the side of the stage. He had seen interviews go off track before, but something about this felt different. There was real tension building between the host and guest, not just the usual playful banter. Can we please just talk about the movie? Clint asked again, his patience wearing thin. Sure, Jimmy said. But you know what's interesting? Your movies used to be all about the tough guy who doesn't take any nonsense from anybody. The man with no name, Dirty Harry, all those characters. But now you're sitting here getting upset about a few jokes. It's kind of ironic, don't you think? The audience was no longer laughing. They could sense that something was wrong. Nancy Wright kept her camera focused on Clint's face, watching as his expression grew darker and more dangerous. I'm not upset, Clint said in a low voice that sounded exactly like it did in his movies when he was about to draw his gun. But I didn't come here to be disrespected. Disrespected? Jimmy repeated, his eyebrows raised. Come on, Clint. We're just having fun here. This is late-night television. Everyone gets teased a little bit. Maybe that's the problem with late-night television, Clint replied, his famous squint narrowing his eyes to slits. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jimmy Kimmel looked at his note cards, trying to figure out how to get the interview back on track. But something in Clint Eastwood's eyes told him it might be too late for that. Look, Clint, Jimmy said, forcing his television smile back onto his face. I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Let me ask you something different. In your new movie, do you play the grumpy old man character again? You know, the get off my lawn type? The studio audience let out a few nervous chuckles. They could feel the uncomfortable atmosphere, but they weren't sure if this was part of the show or something real happening. Clint's hands gripped the arms of his chair tighter. His knuckles turned white. What did you just say? He asked in a voice so quiet and dangerous that it made everyone in the studio lean forward to hear him. I was just joking about your tough guy image, Jimmy said, but his confidence was starting to crack. You know, like in Gran Torino when you yelled at those kids to get off your lawn. It's become kind of your thing. My thing? Clint repeated, his voice getting louder. You think my entire career is a joke about yelling at kids? Nancy Wright adjusted her camera to capture both men in the same shot. She had never seen an interview go this wrong this fast. Her hands were steady on the camera controls, but her heart was beating faster. No, that's not what I meant, Jimmy said quickly. I meant it's an iconic moment. People love that character. People love it? Or you love making fun of it? Clint shot back. His famous squint was in full effect now, making him look exactly like he did in his Western movies when he was about to have a showdown. Jake Peterson whispered to his wife in the audience. This doesn't feel like acting, he said. I think they're really fighting. Jimmy tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out forced and fake. Come on, Clint, you've got to have a sense of humor about yourself. Everyone in Hollywood gets teased, it's part of the business. Is it? Clint asked, leaning forward in his chair. Because it seems to me like you only tease certain people. People you think are easy targets. That's not true, Jimmy protested. I make fun of everyone equally. Do you? Clint's voice was getting stronger and more confident, like he was finding his footing in this unexpected battle. When was the last time you made jokes about someone's age when they were 30 years old? When did you last bring up embarrassing moments from a young actor's past? The audience was completely silent now. Even the crew members who usually moved around during commercial breaks were standing still, watching the confrontation unfold. Paul Rodriguez, the stage manager, spoke quietly into his headset. We might have a situation here, he told the control room. This is getting heated. You're being too sensitive, Jimmy said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I joke about young actors all the time. I make fun of their social media posts, their dating lives, their movies. It's comedy. But you don't treat them like they're relics from the past, Clint replied. You don't act like they should be grateful just to be allowed in the same room as you. I never said that, Jimmy protested. You didn't have to say it, Clint shot back. It's in every question you ask, every joke you make. You think because I'm older, because I come from a different time, that I'm somehow less relevant than you. Amy Foster, the sound engineer, was trying to keep the audio level steady, but both men's voices were rising. She had worked on talk shows for 10 years and had never heard a guest challenge a host like this. That's ridiculous, Jimmy said, but he was starting to look uncomfortable. You're a legend. Everyone respects you. Do they? Clint asked, standing up from his chair. The movement was sudden and powerful, making several people in the audience gasp. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you invited me here to be the butt of your jokes. Jimmy stayed seated behind his desk, but he pushed his chair back slightly. Clint Eastwood standing up and angry was an intimidating sight, even for someone who dealt with celebrities every night. Sit down, Clint, Jimmy said, trying to regain control of his show. Let's just calm down and finish the interview. I'll sit when I'm ready to sit, Clint replied, his voice carrying all the authority of someone who had been giving orders on movie sets for 60 years. Right now, I'm trying to figure out if you think this is funny. Think what's funny? Jimmy asked. Disrespecting people who paved the way for you to have this job, Clint said, pointing his finger at Jimmy. I was making movies when you were still in diapers. I was creating characters that people still remember and love decades later. And you think that gives you the right to treat me like some old fool who doesn't know what century he's living? And the studio was so quiet that the humming of the air conditioning system seemed loud. Betty Collins, a retired teacher sitting in the 5th row, later told reporters that she had never felt such tension in a room before. I never called you an old fool, Jimmy said weakly. You didn't have to, Clint replied. Every joke about my age, every reference to the past, every suggestion that I'm out of touch with modern times, it all adds up to the same thing. You think I'm a joke. Jimmy looked toward the stage manager, hoping for some kind of rescue, but Paul Rodriguez just shrugged. This was uncharted territory for everyone involved. Look, Jimmy tried again. Maybe we should take a commercial break and start over. Start over? Clint laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You think you can just reset this like it's some kind of video game? This is real life, son. Words have consequences. Don't call me son, Jimmy said, finally showing some anger of his own. I'm not your child and this is my show. Your show? Clint repeated. Your show built on making fun of people who can't fight back? Your show that thinks age is something to be ashamed of? That's not what this show is about, Jimmy protested. Then what is it about? Clint demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a young man who thinks he's clever making jokes at the expense of someone who's been working in this business longer than you've been alive. The confrontation had moved far beyond a simple disagreement. This was now a battle between two different generations, two different views of respect and entertainment, two different ideas of what was acceptable in public discourse. Clint Eastwood was still standing, towering over Jimmy Kimmel's desk like a storm cloud ready to burst. His finger was still pointed at the talk show host, and his face showed the same dangerous expression that had made him famous in dozens of Western movies. You want to know what's really funny? Clint said, his voice getting louder with each word. A comedian who thinks respect is something you can joke away. A man who sits behind a desk every night making fun of people who actually built something with their lives. Jimmy Kimmel looked around desperately. The studio audience was completely silent, staring at the two men like they were watching a car accident happen in slow motion. Some people in the front row looked scared. Others seemed fascinated by seeing a real fight instead of scripted television. Clint, please, Jimmy said, trying to sound calm but failing. You need to sit down. This is still a television show. We have standards. Standards? Clint laughed, but the sound was cold and bitter. Your standards include making fun of old people? Your standards include bringing up embarrassing moments from someone's past just to get a cheap laugh? Paul Rodriguez, the stage manager, spoke urgently into his headset. We need security up here now, he whispered. This is getting out of control. Rick Hansen, the head of security for the studio, was already moving toward the stage. He had been watching the interview from his position near the back of the audience, and he could see that something bad was about to happen. Rick was a big man, 6 feet 4 inches tall and built like a football player. He had worked security for television shows for 15 years and had dealt with plenty of difficult situations. I won't be silenced by some late-night comedian who thinks he's important, Clint continued, his voice echoing through the studio. I've been making movies since before you were born. I've directed films that won Academy Awards. I've created characters that people still love 50 years later. And you think that gives you the right to treat me like I'm some senile old man who wandered onto your stage by mistake? Jimmy stood up behind his desk trying to match Clint's height, but the legendary actor was still taller and much more intimidating. This is my show, Jimmy said, his own voice rising. I decide what happens here, and I won't tolerate this kind of aggressive behavior from any guest. Aggressive behavior? Clint repeated, taking a step closer to Jimmy's desk. You haven't seen aggressive yet, boy. That was the moment when everything changed. The word boy hung in the air like a challenge. Jimmy's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. The audience gasped. Nancy Wright's camera captured every second of the confrontation. Rick Hansen reached the edge of the stage and motioned to Tony Lopez, the security guard who had been watching the green room earlier. Tony quickly moved to join his supervisor. Both men were experienced in handling upset celebrities, but they had never seen anything quite like this. Sir, Rick said in a calm, professional voice as he approached Clint from the side, I'm going to need you to step back and lower your voice. Clint turned to look at the security guard, his eyes blazing with anger. Don't tell me what to do, he said. I'm not the one who started this fight. Nobody started a fight, Rick replied, keeping his distance but ready to move if necessary. But we need to keep everyone safe, including you. Safe from what? Clint demanded. From the truth? From someone finally calling out this disrespectful behavior? Jimmy was still standing behind his desk, but now he looked smaller and less confident. The situation had moved far beyond anything he knew how to handle. His show was usually filled with scripted jokes and friendly conversations with celebrities who were there to promote their projects. This kind of real conflict was completely outside his experience. Mr. Eastwood, Jimmy said, trying to regain some control. I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Maybe we should just end the interview and you can go home. A misunderstanding? Clint shot back. There's no misunderstanding. You disrespected me, and you disrespected everyone my age who's ever had to listen to your jokes. You think being young makes you smart, but it just makes you ignorant." Kate Miller, the producer, had rushed onto the stage from the wings. Her face was pale with worry. This was turning into the worst nightmare any television producer could imagine. A live interview going completely wrong with one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history. "Clint, please," Kate said, approaching carefully. "Let's just take a break and talk about this privately." "I'm tired of talking privately," Clint replied, not taking his eyes off Jimmy. "I'm tired of being polite while people like him make jokes at my expense. If he wants to act like a bully, then maybe it's time someone stood up to him." Betty Collins, the retired teacher in the audience, would later tell reporters that she had never seen anything like it. "It was like watching two different worlds collide," she said. "The old Hollywood and the new Hollywood, and they couldn't understand each other at all." Rick Hansen decided it was time to act. He stepped closer to Clint with Tony Lopez moving, and from the other side. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us," Rick said firmly. "This interview is over." "The interview was over the minute he decided to disrespect me," Clint said, but he didn't resist as the security guards moved closer. "I won't stand here and be made fun of by someone who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real world." Jimmy finally found his voice again. "The real world?" he said angrily. "What do you know about the real world? You've been living in Hollywood mansions for 50 years. That comment made Clint's anger flare up again. "I know about respect," he said, his voice getting dangerous again. "I know about treating people with dignity. I know about earning what you have instead of just making jokes about people who actually worked for their success." "Mr. Eastwood," Rick said more firmly, "we need to leave now." Clint looked around the studio one more time. The audience was staring at him with a mixture of shock and fascination. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of his breakdown. The crew members were standing frozen, not sure whether to keep working or run for cover. "Fine," Clint said finally. "I'll leave. But not because I'm wrong. I'll leave because this place doesn't deserve to have me here." He turned away from Jimmy's desk and began walking toward the exit, with Rick Hansen and Tony Lopez flanking him on either side. His back was straight, and his head was held high, even in defeat. The heavy door slammed shut behind Clint Eastwood as Rick Hansen and Tony Lopez escorted him out of the studio. The sound echoed through the building like a gunshot. Inside the studio, Jimmy Kimmel stood alone on his stage, looking stunned and confused. The audience sat in complete silence, not sure what they had just witnessed. Jimmy ran his hand through his hair and looked at the cameras that were still recording everything. He had been doing late-night television for over 20 years, but nothing had prepared him for what just happened. His comfortable world of scripted jokes and friendly celebrity interviews had just been turned upside down by a 94-year-old actor who refused to play by the rules. "Well," Jimmy said finally, trying to force a smile onto his face. "That was certainly unexpected." A few people in the audience let out nervous laughs, but most remained quiet. They could tell that something important had just happened, something that went beyond normal television entertainment. Paul Rodriguez, the stage manager, was frantically speaking into his headset, trying to figure out what to do next. The show was supposed to continue for another 20 minutes, but the main guest had just been thrown out. There were no backup plans for this kind of situation. Outside the studio, Clint walked slowly toward his waiting limousine. His publicist, Lisa Barnes, was already on the phone, trying to do damage control before the story hit the news. Rick Hansen and Tony Lopez followed at a respectful distance, making sure he left the property safely. "Mr. Eastwood," Rick said as they reached the parking area. "I'm sorry things went that way. We were just doing our job." Clint stopped and turned to look at the security supervisor. His anger had cooled slightly, but his eyes still held the intensity that had made him famous. "You did your job fine," he said. "The problem wasn't with you." Back inside the studio, Jimmy was trying to salvage what was left of his show. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the audience, "we're going to take a short commercial break, and when we come back, we'll have some music from our next guest." But everyone knew that the real show was already over. The confrontation between Jimmy Kimmel and Clint Eastwood would be the only thing anyone remembered from tonight's taping. Nancy Wright kept her camera rolling, capturing Jimmy's uncomfortable attempts to return to normal television. Jake Peterson turned to his wife in the audience. "I can't believe what we just saw," he whispered. "That was real. That was actually real." His wife nodded, still shocked by the intensity of the argument. "I felt sorry for both of them," she said quietly. "But I think the old man had a point." Within minutes of Clint's exit, people in the audience were already pulling out their phones and posting about what they had witnessed. The hashtag #ClintVsJimmy started trending on social media before the show had even finished taping. Videos taken by audience members began appearing online, showing shaky footage of the legendary actor standing up to the talk show host. Chris Morgan, an entertainment reporter for a major news website, was monitoring social media when the first posts started appearing. He immediately recognized the significance of what was happening. A confrontation between two major figures in entertainment, broadcast live on television, was exactly the kind of story that could dominate news cycles for weeks. Chris quickly began making phone calls to his sources, trying to get more details about what had happened at the Jimmy Kimmel show. Within an hour, he had confirmation from 3 different people who had been in the studio. The story was real, and it was big. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood sat in the back of his limousine as it drove through the streets of Hollywood. He stared out the window at the city where he had spent most of his adult life, thinking about what had just happened. Part of him regretted losing his temper on national television, but another part of him felt good about finally standing up to the kind of treatment he had been receiving for years. Lisa Barnes finished her phone call and looked at her most famous client. "The story is already spreading online," she told him. "We need to decide how to respond to this." "What's to respond to?" Clint asked, still looking out the window. "I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. That young man was disrespectful, and someone needed to call him out on it. But this is going to be everywhere tomorrow," Lisa replied. "Every news show, every website, every social media platform. People are going to have opinions about this." Clint finally turned to look at his publicist. "Let them have opinions," he said. "I've been dealing with other people's opinions for 70 years. I'm not going to start worrying about them now." Back at the studio, the show had ended, and the audience was filing out. Many of them were still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. Betty Collins, the retired teacher, stopped to speak with a news reporter who was waiting outside the building. "It was like watching a piece of history," she told the reporter. "2 different generations, 2 different ways of thinking, and they just couldn't find any common ground. It was sad, but it was also fascinating." The reporter asked her who she thought was right in the argument. Betty considered the question carefully before answering. "I think they were both right about some things and wrong about others," she said. "The old man deserved more respect than he got, but the young man was just doing his job the way he always does it. Maybe the real problem is that we've forgotten how to disagree with each other without turning it into a war." Helen Adams, Clint's longtime agent, was already fielding phone calls from reporters and other entertainment industry figures. Some were critical of Clint's behavior, saying he had acted unprofessionally and embarrassed himself. Others supported him, arguing that he had been provoked and had every right to defend himself. Gary Turner, a network executive, called an emergency meeting with his staff to discuss the situation. The clip of the confrontation was already being viewed millions of times online, making it the most watched segment in Jimmy Kimmel Live history. "This is either going to be a disaster or the best thing that ever happened to the show," Gary told his team. "We need to figure out which one it is and respond accordingly." The debate about what had happened in the studio that night was just beginning. Social media was exploding with arguments between people who supported Clint Eastwood and those who defended Jimmy Kimmel. The story was spreading beyond entertainment news into mainstream media, with serious journalists analyzing what the confrontation meant for Hollywood, for generational conflicts, and for the treatment of older people in American society. By morning, the argument between a legendary actor and a late-night talk show host would become a cultural flashpoint that revealed deep divisions in how people thought about respect aging, entertainment, and the changing values of American society.